You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is all about the cycles of grief. Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating the sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hey, Miriam Susan here. Today we're going to be talking about the cycles of grief when it comes to having a relationship with toxic in-laws and some of the things that you may see coming up for your husband as he navigates this rocky, crazy path of dealing with his parents. Now, I say the cycles of grief. Why? A lot of us think that grief is a very linear thing. We have a moment in time where something is lost, whether it is the loss of a loved one or the loss of a dream or a loss of what we perceived a relationship would be, in this case with toxic in-laws. And then we go through different stages like anger and bargaining and all those kinds of things. And then at some point we think in the future, all of that is going to be behind us. We're going to be in a state of perpetual peace and maybe be a little bit wiser having gone through the process. And what I have observed and experienced vicariously through watching my husband go through the process of coming to the realization that his parents were highly toxic to me, to our children, to him, to our marriage and our family, and then making the decision to request that they not contact us. And then following through on that, now we are over 5 years out from our first request for his parents to not contact us, and it has not been a linear process. There have been many ups and downs, many forwards and backwards. It's been a wild ride. And it's almost like one of those rides at an amusement park where you get on and you think it's going to be one way and it's going along a certain path, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, it switches directions and you turn the other way, or maybe it starts going backwards. That's what this process is like. I definitely was foolish in thinking that when we went no contact with his parents, that things would miraculously get better, or that his parents would miraculously wake up from this, virtual smack upside the head, that things would change. And it just didn't work out that way. I mean, actually, things did change and they got exponentially worse for us when my husband initially requested that they not contact us. So this whole process emotionally has been a very challenging one. And as a wife, kind of being not necessarily on the sidelines of it all happening, because as a wife, we are considered one in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of God. And so what affects my husband affects me too. But seeing him go through this process has been frustrating. It's been exasperating. It's been sad. It's been heartbreaking. It's been relief and sometimes having momentary peace. And I just want to make you aware that if you're going through this, it's not as easy as a 1, 2, 3 step process. And then at the end, you get your certificate and you're healed. Because we don't work that way. As human beings, we're very complex, and we're not just a body. We're not just a physical being. We have souls, we have minds, and we have memories. And the memories tend to be, based on the research that I have done, based on the readings that I have read, our memories can be either forefront in our minds very fresh, very in your face kind of things. But there's also a lot of memories that we have that have affected how our brains are actually physically structured. There is actual physical science that has been discovered showing that our thoughts actually create physical pathways in our brains, which is absolutely fascinating to me because I never realized that that's how it worked. I didn't realize how certain things, when done over and over and over again, can create pretty solid, let's say, expressways in your brain. So to make a very complex process simplified based on how I understand it, the first time we experience a thought or experience something, it's almost like traipsing through a jungle where there is no path. And you're just putting down that first step in basically untouched land. And it's very difficult, if you can imagine, trying to blaze a trail through a jungle because there's so much resistance in terms of vines and undergrowth and the condition of the soil. Is it wet? Is it dry? And so that first instance, something happens, it's not a very solid pathway. But every time a new person or you travel that pathway, then the next time something happens that is very similar to that first step through the jungle, it wears it down a little bit and it makes it a more clear path until eventually, if we think about the development of interstate highways in the United States, those highways began because somebody needed an easy path to get from point A to point B. And at the very beginning, when it was basically just raw land, it was difficult. But over time, things got easier. The vegetation started to die away. It was easier to travel that path. Going from being used to driving on a freeway where traffic is usually free-flowing and there's really nothing that you have to think about except the other cars on the road. You're not having to think about, bringing a machete to chop down branches so you can get through. Changing from driving on your mental freeways on those paths that are well established versus going off-road, it's very, very challenging. And as you or your husband or whoever, anyone, grows up in a toxic environment, no matter what the patterns are, if it's your husband being used to being told that he's too sensitive and constantly belittled, well, he's going to have a pretty solid pathway. If that was something that was consistent in his life growing up, he's going to have a pretty solid freeway, expressway for his thoughts to immediately go to, I'm too sensitive, there's something wrong with me. If one of the pathways was that if dad gives me the silent treatment, something's bad, then guess what? Guess what he brings into your marriage? If there's any point where, like I've experienced this, if I'm not feeling well, if I have a headache, if I just don't have anything to say and I'm a little quiet, very rarely am I angry at my husband. I don't use silence as a punishment, but because of how he was raised, silence was a punishment. So when I'm quiet and not feeling well and not very chatty, his brain immediately goes down the pathway, the well-worn pathway of, she's mad at me. So our memories have a very long-lasting effect on our lives. And what's interesting is I was talking with my husband about this book that he's reading. He's reading a book by Dr. Romani. I've mentioned her before. She's just released a new book called It's Not You. And from what I gather, it is all about helping people who have been victims of narcissistic abuse learn how to heal. And one of the realizations that my husband had was of the trauma bond. And it sounds like it would be some kind of bond that you create when you have been through a traumatic experience with somebody. And that is not really the definition of a trauma bond. A trauma bond in the psychological sense, according to Dr. Ramani, is a bond that happens when you are subjected to good and bad. And so you kind of associate both together, and it creates just a really toxic bond between two people. And when it's the case of a child and his parent, that's hard to deal with. Because as a child, obviously children do not have the capacity to understand everything that's going on and to realize, okay, mom is mad, but it's not about anything that I've done. Dad is doing this, but it's not because of anything I've done. Children internalize things. Because why would someone who is one of their primary caregivers treat me in such a way that's not loving unconditionally? Because children love unconditionally, don't they? Unless they're taught otherwise, children love without question. It doesn't matter. I don't know how many stories you could find of children who were raised by drug addicts, highly abusive parents. And if those children are removed from the home and put into foster care, those children still want a relationship with their mommy and their daddy because they love unconditionally. But that love that a child gives in a toxic relationship is not reciprocated. And so what the child learns that love is very conditional. And so one of the examples that my husband was reading about was that of the trauma bond. And it talked about how with the trauma bond, there are good times. There are what seem to be normal, happy, good times, vacation, fun times, just, silly stuff, playing with chalk on the driveway, just doing normal family things. And then the tide turns and something bad happens and things go haywire. And depending on the person, it could be relatively mild or extremely abusive physically, lots of punishments. It's a scale. But the bond is there. And one of the things that struck my husband as interesting is that he knew, based on the cycles that he grew up with, that when things were good between him and his parents, he was almost on edge and couldn't enjoy them because he knew the bad was coming. So the goodness was always tainted a bit because he knew something bad was coming. And then, when the bad things were happening, he would diminish their severity in his mind because he knew that at the end of this, good times would be back again. And so, according to Dr. Ramani, that's kind of how a trauma bond works. How the victim downplays the bad because they compare it against the good times and they think, could somebody be that bad if they can be this good? Because it doesn't make sense, right? Like we hear these stories of these people who do awful, awful things, murders, whatever. And yet we find out later, well, he was a pillar in his church. He was in the choir. He was in the Knights of Columbus. He walked dogs for his neighbors. He took care of his elderly neighbor's lawn. All these things. And it doesn't make sense. But things don't make sense in a mind that is affected with whatever it is that causes them to be toxic. So let's get back to the grief cycle. Part of dealing with someone, a spouse, husband who has been subjected to something like narcissistic abuse is that throughout their entire life, things have been their fault. And that's a really solid expressway of thought that our husbands may have. So when they see their parent going crazy, doing things that we as wives find totally and completely unacceptable, they don't see it that way. Maybe they're thinking, okay, it's really not that bad. Or maybe it's my fault. Maybe it's my doing. It's my fault that my parents are acting like this. If I would just let them fill in the blank, then things would be better. And those things might be, let my children spend the night. Maybe it's just go on vacation with them. They're paying for it. It'd be fun to go on vacation. Never mind that your husband would know that there are strings attached, but your husband might be so willing to suffer a little bad so that he can get some of the good. I hope this is making sense. So the grief that our husbands deal with is very cyclical. They will have times when they are 110% confident that keeping some distance between your family and his parents is the right thing to do. It is really the only solution. They can speak to priests and religious brothers and their religious friends and people who are solid in the faith and therapists and be told that they are doing the right thing. My husband has been told, brother, you're doing what you need to do to protect your family. Your family is your priority. It comes before the preferences of your parents. You're doing the right thing. And in those moments, he is confident. He knows that this is what we're supposed to be doing. And then things change because everything's cyclical. When things are good, we're just waiting for the bad to come. And so there are times, and they can be triggered by holidays, Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Memorial Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, any of these holidays. And your husband can almost like a switch is flipped, where immediately he's back into that paradigm that his parents live in, their own thought paradigm, and he's thinking, there's got to be something else. It's all my fault. There's got to be something else we haven't tried. There's got to be something else that we haven't done yet to allow for reconciliation, to allow for a relationship, and sometimes we get the blame. If we would only come around. And ladies, I say this because this is a conversation my husband and I have had within this last week. He shared this with me. He's so solid as a husband and as a father, and he knows that his role is like St. Joseph to protect our family from any outside forces of evil, even his parents. Yet, those thought pathways that were formed from the time he was born, that his family, meaning his parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins, they are the world. And to cut them off is pretty much unthinkable. And if there's any rift between our family and his parents, when he's in that state of mind, it's our fault. And it might be your fault, just like it might be my fault. And that's part of the grieving process. Part of the grieving process for our husbands is to come to grips with the gravity of the reality of the situation. And for them, things don't tend to be black and white. Some things are. If there was a serious incident, perhaps it would be black and white. But ladies, I've heard stories of wives who have had in-laws who have done unspeakable things to their son and his family. And that man, because of those pathways, because of the way he was trained to think from the time he was born, he will still want to return to his parents. He will still want to try to find a way to make amends, to make things all right, so that there can be peace in the relationship with his parents. And know at the same time that things were messed up. Things have happened that have caused his own family, his wife and his children, harm. Now, I can logically understand why that is. I can logically understand that the neural pathways that were formed for my husband and the way he was trained to think are pretty hard to change. Just like it's very hard for me to decide that I'm going to be in bed at night by 10 o'clock and wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. That feels like a pretty stinking big mountain to climb to change how I think about going to bed and my bedtime routine. And it's going to be the same thing for our husbands. And as they try to create new pathways of thinking, new paths for their thoughts to go down, it's logically understandable that there will be times when their resistance is low. Maybe they're tired. Maybe there's a trigger of a holiday. Something comes up where it's easier for them to think the way that they were trained to think from the time they were little. And that's where we have to stand strong, but yet be compassionate. And it's hard. It's really, really hard because I can be pretty black and white in my thinking in terms of what is acceptable and what is not. We've had a lot of things that are unacceptable come via his parents. And my husband is so forgiving and at times seems to be willing to forget about all of the craziness in a desire to just almost like erase the past and make things okay with his parents again. And during that time when I try to gently confront him, I'm not very good at being gentle to confront him about these things because I tend to just call it as it is. Maybe it's because I feel like I spent over 20 years trying to sidestep it and not be very direct because I didn't want to be the kind of wife that was like my mother-in-law who was very demanding of her husband. And I didn't want to be like that with my husband and say, it's my way or the highway. But so now I feel like I am a bit more upfront and direct when these things kind of happen, when he goes down this other path. And as he goes down that path, there is a deep sense of grief and mourning that comes along with it. Because on some level, I know that these men realize things are broken. They realize things are not the way they ought to be. And they are very brokenhearted over the life that they imagined they would have with their parents. In this past week, my husband has shared how deeply sad he is that our boys will never go on hunting trips with him and his dad. Our youngest would not do well on a hunting trip, but that's beside the point. Because that was a tender, wonderful memory for my husband growing up, was going out hunting with his dad and his grandfather. Or going out fishing with his other grandfather and spending time with them. And we've had good times with my in-laws. I can't deny that. And so my husband could see that going forward into the future and seeing just a nice relationship between his parents and our kids. And then by extension, because of all the things that have gone on, we don't really have contact with my husband's siblings, specifically his brother and his brother's family. And we have children that could be very close, and they're not, because of this rift, because his brother and his wife see things in a very different way than we do. And perhaps they will never see the reality of what we have gone through, because honestly, they've never asked for our side of the story. They've never stopped to consider that perhaps there are two sides to this story, and they're only getting one side. And each of us has our own bias, but we have never even gotten the chance to explain or share all of the things that led to us being where we are today. And so my husband mourns that. He mourns the loss of potential relationships, potential good memories, potential good times. Because, like I said earlier, these trauma bond relationships are built on good leading to bad, leading to good, leading to bad, and this cycle that continues over and over and over again. And when things were good with his parents, I didn't really say anything because things were good. And then when they were bad, my husband knew, okay, this is going to pass, and then it'll be good again, until it got to where the bad was really bad and we needed to address it. As you walk with your husband on this journey of dealing with his toxic parents, show him compassion in the best way that you can. Listen to him. Understand that he has a devotion to his parents. And it's an innate devotion that I feel we all have to our parents. If your husband tends to favor his parents consistently over you, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to a professional and to talk with a counselor, a therapist, a priest even. Although I would suggest that you go to somebody who is experienced in toxic relationships over a priest. Not that priests don't have their place, but not all of them are trauma-informed. Not all of them understand toxic relationships, toxic family dynamics. And so, as well-meaning as a priest may intend to be, they might not be giving you the counsel that you and your husband need to move forward in the healthiest way possible. But be compassionate towards your husband. Let him know that you are on the same team. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is to feel like you are on the same team, because there should not be a competition between you and your in-laws. But there are cycles of grief that come with this realization that things with his parents are not as they should be. And so don't be surprised if 1 month your husband is dead set on drawing strict lines, having your specific family expectations upheld, really keeping his parents at arm's length, and then the next month him doubting all of that and feeling like he's to blame. It's all his fault. He needs to find whatever hidden secret way that y'all haven't tried before to make the reconciliation possible without any change from his parents. Now, if his parents show signs of change, signs of repentance, that's different. I'm talking about toxic parents who shift the blame to you, shift the blame to your husband, to your kids, whoever. It's not their fault. They're the victim. That's a different situation than in-laws who are willing to demonstrate that they are changing and offer sincere and genuine apologies and make amends. That's a different situation. Although this path is long and it's hard, just letting your husband know that you're with him and you're on his side can really change things. And pray for him. Pray for him. Pray and ask Saint Michael to guard you and protect you. Ask our Blessed Mother, say the novena for Mary, Undoer of Knots. Ask Saint Jude, patron saint of lost causes, to intercede for you. Ask Saint Dymphna, the patron saint for mental health, to pray for you. There are saints who are ready and willing and eager to intercede to the Lord for you on your behalf. And I would encourage you to make use of them, because they would be so grateful to do that for you. And know that I am praying for you. I know this is hard, and I am so humbled that you tune into my podcast and you listen to whatever words of wisdom, whatever nuggets I have to share. But I really just want you to know that you're not alone, and that I love you and I am praying for you. Please reach out at any point if you would like to talk to me. We could set up a time to do some coaching. hello@desiringpeace.com is my email. And with that, I will sign off and wish you many blessings as you endure these trials together with your husband. Go in peace. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. I have a free gift for you that I would love for you to get. It is my free scripts for toxic in-laws. It's a little PDF that you can use to give you some examples of how to speak to your in-laws about certain issues. I'd love to give it to you absolutely free. So if you head to desiringpeace.com/gift, it will be there waiting for you. Just enter your name and email so you can start using it for inspiration on how to talk with your toxic in-laws. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. Go to desiringpeace.com/gift to claim your gift now. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and/or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.